Hello and welcome to this special show. It's actually an episode of The Big Fight, but we are looking at a momentous moment in Indian history. And it's 24/7 that we're looking back to. So 24/7 on 24/7 is really what you're having out here. We're looking back to a day exactly 25 years ago when Dr. Manmohan Singh stood up in Parliament and delivered his budget speech. And that budget speech is seen as the starting point or the most seminal moment of reform in India. That's when the economic reform started. That's when people say India was put onto a new trajectory, a trajectory that's seen our growth rate going from the 3% or what was used to be once upon a time called the Hindu rate of growth to something completely different and to a position where today we are the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, there will be critics. There will be people who will say the reforms were not the right thing to do, or India could have achieved this in other ways, or even if the reforms were fine, India hasn't done things correctly. But by and large, it was a landmark moment in Indian history, the start of reforms 25 years ago. So today, we have assembled some of the people who were crucially involved with that entire reform process, who are going to tell us how it happened, and others who have been taking part in it over the years and with suggestions and thoughts on how it could have been different. And then we'll also get some critics who will say, why do you think the entire process has been wrong? So let me start off by welcoming among the people who played a major role in it, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It's great to have you here with us. You were former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, of course, but you were Commerce Secretary, I think, at the time when the speech was done. N.K. Singh was there in the Ministry of Economic Affairs at that time. Crucially. Well, I'm going to welcome Harsh Mandar, who's here, who's going to be telling us why he doesn't think the reform process has been entirely great. And Pradeep Baijal's with us, who's been very crucially involved with reforms a little later and also been critical about the reform process. You handled disinvestment, which is one of the most tricky words to be doing, and also telecom reforms, obviously.
And before that, the power reformed for about 6 years.
And power reforms as well. So yes, all of people involved with the reform process. We also have with us Yashwant Sinha, who was Finance Minister of India just before those reforms started off, and of course was Finance Minister later as well, and did his own bit of kickstarting reform. Sitaram Yechuri is with us, General Secretary of the CPIM, and you can guess what his views are on some of the reform steps that we've seen. And finally, we do have Mr. D. Raja with us as well, National Secretary of the CPI. Can I just start off, if I may, Montek, by taking you back 25 years ago today, when the Finance Minister at that time, Manmohan Singh, got up to give that budget speech, did all of you realize that this is a turning point in Indian history?
Many of the big changes that happened before he got up, because the devaluation took place on the 1st and the 3rd of July, the new trade policy was announced on the 4th of July, and the industrial policy was announced in Parliament before the Finance Minister spoke. But, you know, we knew that he was going to put this all together. And I think the really interesting thing about Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget speech in '91 is it's the first budget speech that gave a holistic picture of reform and said, look, this is not just something we're doing now. We've got to do it over the next several years. And I think that, to me, was a very important difference from the usual budget speech.
So their budget, it was like a manifesto for reform, and then by and large that manifesto has been adhered to, at least in some areas, like de-licensing and trade reforms. Those issues were almost settled on that particular date.
I agree that lots had been done before the formal budget speech. It's another matter of how much was an act of conscious choice and how much was it really out of the compulsions of those times. And if you look at some of the things like the quarterly performance criteria, which we agreed with the International Monetary Fund, which we happily laid in the Library of Parliament and not in Parliament, it contains the kind of things which India committed to do. And many of the things, Vikram, are quite startling. Even things like VAT and GST are kind of ingredients which were contained in that big document which we had laid.
So a lot of compulsion behind what happened there. And that's an interesting point, because I'm going to come back to that, because many would argue in the 25 years since then, India has often reformed only when there's been a gun to our head, which is sad. Maybe we could have gone even faster otherwise. But do you feel that that's the case? We wouldn't have reformed even then?
I definitely feel that.
Or did you You'd brought out a note, hadn't you? And now confess, it was
I don't agree
the
with
M
it.
document.
I don't agree with this view, but let me qualify it. There's no doubt that, you know, we were on the brink of a precipice. So if we didn't reform, we would go downhill. But the idea that we reformed because the IMF told us to, I think wrong. I mean, I've written a piece in the EPW, which just came out, which documents that in the previous few years, my note is one of them, several
that was your note, right? The famous M document which was floating around,
yes,
stating.
It was. No, but
did you get into trouble for floating it before it was?
No, interestingly, not at all. I mean, I got in trouble in the sense a lot of politicians complained about. The only people who really got upset were the Planning Commission, because they said, "How dare somebody from the PMO talk about policies when it should really be the Planning Commission that does it?" But the key point you got to remember is all the ideas. Not all. I mean, I think what was done in '91 was more than some of the ideas that had floated around before. Okay. But it's certainly not true that we were set on a course, and then we had a crisis, and then the IMF said, "Come and sign on the dotted line." Okay. I would say rather that people who wanted to do reform.
I don't think that I was quite implying that with the gun on the head you did it. The compulsions of the time gave you very little options. So it was really, I think, that born out of the huge crisis we were in, and what was necessary to get out of that crisis.
All right, Mr. Raja, at the end of the day, India had no choice but to reform. And those years of industrial licensing, license permit rajas, state planning, companies not being allowed to go out and invest, that was wrong. Would you agree with that, that those years were wrong?
Exactly, this was the argument given at that point of time. There is no alternative. TINA factor, which is really influencing the economic development or economic course in our country. In fact, when the reform process was begun, the left took a very critical position. We wanted pro-people reform, but actually what happened, pro-capital reform. Now the entire reform process has reached a critical, crucial stage. Economy is in bad shape. My point is, it is a fact in India, the reform process has led to unprecedented inequalities in our society, in our
reforms leading to inequality
of our people.
Reforms leading to inequality is one of those things. But let's rewind back a little further. There was a long period of Indian history where it was actually believed you should control industry, you must have licensing, do not allow people to overproduce. I mean, sometimes you forget it. Companies were prevented from producing more than a certain amount of goods. It almost sounds laughable today, but that's what industrial licensing was. We had import substitution policies and all of that. The theory behind that, Mr. Raja, before I come back to them, do you believe that those theories at least were wrong and that held India back through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 40 years, perhaps we wasted? China reformed earlier. South Korea and others had reformed even earlier, even before that.
The whole reform process started in China in 1978. It was started in agriculture first. And we should understand how China made progress in the past years. When we discuss India, if there is any reform that is to end the license raj or to end the red tape delays, one can understand administrative reforms, bureaucratic reforms. But changing the fundamentals of economy, that has led to a lot of problems, that because Indian economy's strength lies in public sector. In the name of neoliberal economic policies, what my friend Mr. Mantek Singh Ahluwalia brought in was PPP, public-private partnership. There is neither public nor partnership, it is only private ownership. That is what happened in India. We should try to understand. And the public sector has been weakened. Public sector banking industry has been weakened. Public sector insurance company has been weakened over these years. These are supposed to be the fundamentals of Indian economy. Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, when he was finance minister, now he is the president of India, he admitted the fundamentals of Indian economy are quite strong. What are the fundamentals of Indian economy? I asked, if not the public sector undertakings, public sector banks, public sector insurance companies. Now everything is privatized. There is reckless disinvestment, privatization of public
Reckless-
sector undertakings,
Pradeep
handing
Bajaj,
over the natural
reckless
resources,
disinvestment.
everything
Is that-
to the private
Is that
hands.
what government after government has been doing? Actually, privatization is a word that most of you are too scared to use.
Yes.
Even when you were disinvesting,
Yes.
people, you're too scared to say privatization. You and Mr. Arun Shourie used to tiptoe around that particular word, and till today, nobody says we are privatizing. It's disinvestment.
That is very true. But
Was that consciously? Because you knew if you said privatization, all hell would break loose.
well, 2000 it was privatization, and people who were reading the government orders, government literature, etc., were not fools. When they knew that the ownership was changing, and ownership was changing in a big way, we were changing the ownership of one company per month. So people were not fools. But yes, we kept using disinvestment.
Let me just come back one more time to what the situation was in 1991, because I'm reopening the central thesis that do we sometimes only reform when there's a crisis. Let me get Yashwant Sinha, who had been finance minister just before that particular reform bout actually broke out. Mr. Sinha, so 25 years back, we were actually in a crisis before all this reform started. You were the finance minister before the Rao government took over. India had to mortgage its gold reserves. You know, was India actually at that time, to your mind, on the brink of a default? Was it on the edge of a precipice?
India was really on the brink. The situation was much worse, much worse than most people imagine. Today, we were down to $1 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves, which was sufficient only for about 2 weeks of imports. The crisis in the Gulf as a result of the US invasion of Iraq was getting worse by the day. Petroleum product prices were rising, inflation was raising its head. So you had a first-rate economic crisis led by the balance of payments crisis.
All right, now there were obviously reasons why that was happening. Oil prices had just, spiraled. India was in a real chance and a real danger there of defaulting in its payments. Now, were you at that time as finance minister having sleepless nights at the very real possibility that India could go bust? India could actually go bankrupt.
India had something like $5 billion worth of short-term loans at that point of time, which had been contracted during earlier periods. And the short-term debts had to be paid. The greatest chance of default was on account of the short-term debts. And if you have $1 billion worth of reserves and the liabilities are more than $5 billion, you can imagine the situation. So our task was to ensure that India did not default on its external commitments. Because if we had defaulted, then we would have truly become a basket case and nobody would have looked at India. We would have lost all our credibility in the international market.
You're both nodding your head. It was that bad?
Yes, it was. There's no
Could
question
have
about
maybe even worse. I mean, the fact that Mr. Yashwant Sinha had to take that very unpopular decision of mortgaging India's gold, which he keeps repeating, was something which came to haunt him much later in his electoral campaign. It was as bad as that. And therefore, I think that Mr. Yashwant Sinha deserves a lot of credit of really having staved off a
And
debt
that was before the reforms, and those are the steps that had to be...
Before, during the time of Mr. Chandrasekhar.
Right. Mr. Sinha, I just want to come back to you on another theme. At that time, I'm sure you knew some of the steps that needed to be taken when you were the finance minister. I'm sure Montek, NK, others would have been telling you, here are the steps that we need to take. And finally,
unveiled that budget, which he could not pass because the government fell before that. Many of these measures were outlined, in all fairness, in Mr. Yashwant Sinha's interim budget, which he presented to Parliament.
Right. But Mr. Sinha, I think the point I'm trying to ask is, why is it that at that time and in the years since then, it's quite often been difficult for India to pass reform, except when there's a crisis?
For the very simple reason, Bikram, that there is no political consensus even today as far as economic reforms are concerned. One might say that every government in India after 91 has promoted reforms, has acted in favor of reforms, but political consensus has been absent. And the stand that a political party has taken has depended more on where they sit in parliament rather than the national economic interest of the country.
So in other words, you're saying that when you're in government, you say you have to pursue reform, and then when you're sitting in the opposition, you have to block those same reforms. And we are seeing that. We've been seeing that for years. We're seeing that right now with the GST.
Yeah, oppose your own reforms. Oppose the reforms that you had initiated. Even those reforms are opposed if you are in opposition.
All right, Mr. Sinha, I know you have to leave us soon, but I just wanted to ask you your overall assessment of this government. I'm going to come back to that a little later in this program, but before you leave us, do you think that this government is by and large a reformist government?
They are making pronouncements to this effect that they are a reform-oriented government, but according to their own admission, they have not moved with big bang reforms. Their approach has been incremental, and therefore reforms have come in bits and pieces over the last 2 years or so, and the big bang reforms have been absent.
So last question, you would like to see this government doing more big bang reforms than you're seeing so far?
I think that's the way to go, because incremental reforms, the impact of the incremental reforms will be too slow and will not be felt across the broad spectrum of the economy and the population of this country.
A grievance is a complaint against management because management in some way violated the language of the collective agreement. For example, if your contract says that you get paid overtime at time and a half after 40 hours in a week, and your employer insists you take it in time rather than money, then your employer has broken a clause in the collective agreement. Every collective agreement contains a section on the grievance procedure. As a member, you will go to your steward and say, "I want to file a grievance." Your steward takes down the information, and together you go to the supervisor, point out what the contract language says, and ask that it be honored. If the supervisor says no, you can take the grievance to the next step in the grievance process. If the grievance is still unresolved, it can then be referred to an arbitrator who is an independent third party who will listen to both you and the employer and will make a ruling according to the language in the collective agreement. Don't forget that for a legitimate grievance, you need more than a complaint. There must be a violation of the rights spelled out in your collective agreement. It doesn't cover a disagreement between workers. These problems must be addressed in other ways. Some problems are best dealt with by the Health and Safety Committee, a Joint Accommodation Committee, or by an unfair labor practice charge.